This evening, I'm very excited to welcome David Litt, celebrating the release of It's Only Drownin'. David Litt is the New York Times bestselling author of Thanks Obama, Democracy in One Book or Less, and It's Only Drownin'. A former senior speechwriter for Barack Obama, described as the comic muse for the president, for its work on the White House Correspondents' Dinner Monologues. Along with writing speeches and jokes for political figures, athletes, Fortune 500 CEOs, and philanthropists, David was the head writer-producer at Funny or Die, DC, and has written and sold comedy pilots for Comedy Central, ABC, and NBC. In It's Only Drownin', David Litt, the Yale-educated writer with a sensible fear of sharks, takes inspiration from his daredevil brother-in-law, Matt. Along the way, he finds a love for surfing and what it takes to be braver at times when it takes courage just to read the news. Litt will be in conversation with Jennifer Rubin, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Contrarian, a pro-democracy platform that covers politics, policy, and culture. She created a stir when she resigned after 14 years at the Washington Post's top opinion columnist, denouncing owner Jeff Bezos and other media titans for refusing to fulfill their journalistic responsibilities. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, David Litt and Jennifer Rubin.
Hello.
Hello there. Well, now I feel bad for having left the Post because I can clearly see that he's had to scrimp and save on his wedding in order to, get the knot tied there.
Yeah, that's been a hardship.
Yeah, exactly. So I enjoyed this book tremendously, even though I don't surf, I don't like getting wet, I don't like getting cold, I'm not thrilled with sharks. So let's start back at the beginning. You were both colloquially and I think medically depressed after the initial Trump victory. How did you get from there to surfing?
Well, let me just quickly start by saying hello to everybody, including the at least 7 of you I don't know personally, which so thank you for coming. And the other thing that I also want to say is, with all due respect to the meek, I believe that writers with large platforms who help other writers launch their books will inherit the earth. So Jen, I appreciate all of your support, including this afternoon. So we're, like the book itself, we're kind of starting on a down note. For me, I never ever imagined that I would start surfing. I mean, that seemed like something that crazy people would do. And for the record, I still think it's something that crazy people would do. I just identify as a part crazy person. And when you went through your list of reasons you would never begin surfing, I thought, well, actually, most of them apply to me. What changed for me was during the pandemic and really in the aftermath. I've always been sort of high functioning and high anxiety simultaneously. That was the first time I felt really genuinely depressed. And I will say, and as those of you who either know me personally or have read other books that I've written can attest, I don't normally write about stuff like that, but I felt like it was important in this case. And in part it was important because I feel like it was something that so many of us were going through, and I'm hoping that people who are also going through it can read that and feel less alone. And in part, I think it was important because otherwise I would not have done something as crazy as walking into a surf shop and saying, hey, do you know how to teach anyone to surf? And when Katie, the woman behind the counter, said, I could, ignoring the question mark part of her sentence and signing up for lessons.
Well, you have a brother-in-law who features prominently in this, Matt, who was a surfer. And you guys didn't really have a lot in common. He was sort of prototypical red America. You're kind of prototypical blue America. When you decided to take up surfing, it must have had some connection to him. Or did you just, it was the first thing that came to mind? I mean, there are other things you could have done, swimming in a safe pool, going to the beach,
yes.
All kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, so Matt, my brother-in-law, and we never had anything in common. I mean, I met Matt in 2012 when I started dating, I don't know where she went, but my now wife, Jackie. Oh, who's over there? Hello. And so, I met her brother and said, it seems like we're pretty unalike. I mean, he listened to death metal. I listened to Stephen Sondheim. He drove a pickup truck to work. I used 2 computer monitors for work. the thing I always point to is that Matt once threw out his back training to become an amateur ultimate fighter, and I once threw out my back lifting a bag of cat litter. So what's interesting about what you asked, though, is those things never mapped directly onto Red America and Blue America until somewhat recently. Right. And it was really during the pandemic when the fact that he was a huge Joe Rogan fan and I was not, the fact that he was an electrician so works in the trades and I work in front of a screen, all of these things suddenly started to mean a lot more than they had meant before. And in that sense, it kind of felt like we were being drafted into two teams, whether or not we wanted to be. And when I think about my decision to start surfing, and none of this is a lot of trying to figure out retroactively or retrospectively what I was thinking, because it's a question I've asked myself frequently while on a surfboard. And with Matt, I was not about to get a tattoo. That was not happening. I wasn't going to drive a truck because I think I would bump it into something. Surfing was the only thing that he did that I think in the back recesses of my mind I could imagine also doing. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why I chose that instead of, say, swimming in a safe pool. I mean, I guess if Matt crocheted, this would be a very different book.
Absolutely. One of the things I didn't realize, and this is because I know nothing about surfing, is how dangerous it really is. You can die from surfing. You can be maimed by surfing. Now I will never surf, even if I wasn't going to before. But how did you kind of deal with that? I mean, you're a very logical person. You research these things. You get statistics. You follow the sharks. How did you cope with doing something that you could literally die doing?
Well, I found out some very good news when I started surfing, which was that the number of people who die surfing each year is fairly small. The number of ways you can die surfing is enormous. So there's the basic ones, right? You get trapped underwater in a variety of manners, and then you can't breathe, which is important. Then there's all sorts of animals, some of them with large teeth, some of them with small teeth, but a lot of venom. So you really can take your pick. I think for me, so much of this book was about, and when I say this book, what I mean is the experience also that led to the book, was about me reshaping my relationship with fear. Very early on, I think my second surf lesson, I was with my instructor, Katie, the same one who said I could. And I said, well, I've noticed this interesting phenomenon. It feels like every so often the wave looms up behind me and is about to break on top of me and, kill me. Any thoughts? What should I do about that? And I expected Katie to respond with compassion or concern. And instead she looked at me and said, oh, that's the flower of fear, smiling, which was odd. And she explained that for surfers, fear is not just something that you fight or flee from, but sometimes it's something you embrace. And that fear is telling you you're in the right spot. I think about this all the time in our non-surfing lives, which I know, Jen, is all of your life, and it's much of my life too. But we're living in a scary moment, and I feel so much more capable of handling the scary moment in which we live because sometimes I can feel that sense of dread and say, actually, that's the flower of fear. This is my body telling me that I'm in the right spot, not the wrong one.
Now, what was so fascinating about this is there's a whole kind of social ecosphere. And, it's like Jane Goodall going to study the chimps and figuring out who's dominant and who's not and what the family groupings are. Tell us a little bit about the group you discovered in New Jersey. And there was one kind of scary guy that kind of freaked you out, and how you kind of came to deal with those people and view those people.
Well, it's interesting as you were describing this kind of anthropological sense, Jane Goodall and the chimps, but I would say I was more the chimps than Jane Goodall in this situation because I was very much not at the top of any hierarchy. I was at the bottom of this food chain, potentially including the sharks. And so I, very early on realized that surf spots are sort of like high school cafeterias with cliques. So I formed my clique with the VALs, VAL, for vulnerable adult learners. I almost titled the book that, and then I was just like, I don't know that I want to write a book called Vulnerable Adult Learner. I think it got vetoed, but drowning is so much more upbeat. Well, only drowning. See. And so I will say the title from the book comes from something that Matt told me the first time that we went surfing together. So I'd never been surfing with my brother-in-law. Of course, the first time he says, "Hey, do you want to paddle out together?" It's a huge hurricane swell. I'm standing on the beach, and I'm trying very hard to act like I'm not terrified. And finally, I say to him, "Okay, Matt, I have to admit, I'm a little bit scared." And he says, "Oh, don't worry, it's only water." And I think, "Oh, thank you. That's reassuring." And he says, "No, don't worry, it's only drowning." And then he just runs into the ocean.
Right.
And I thought, okay, if I survive this, I know what the book will be called.
Right. One of the things that kind of struck me is that Matt lives in the present. He doesn't overthink things. People like you and I, we spend our life overthinking things. Did you learn something from his approach to life? Is it something that you can actually do or not really?
Well, I think I definitely learned a lot. And to me, this is a book. I mean, I think, we're at Politics and Prose. I think it's sort of safe to say that we all live in a somewhat similar bubble. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone lives in a bubble these days. But I think part of what I was learning and part of what changed for me, I always think about a memoir as the story of how you became who you are now.
Yeah.
And part of what changed for me was realizing how much I could learn from someone who was completely not like me precisely because they're completely not like me. And for me, a big part of that was courage. In surfing, there's this idea of going over the ledge, is the phrase. Basically means that you have to cross that point of no return, and you have to do it before you know what's going to happen. And if you spend your time, as I may have done once or twice, thinking, let me try to calculate what might happen here, you are deeply doomed. You just have to do it. And Matt, he's a very good surfer, but he's not the best surfer in the entire world, right? But he's quite good. The thing he is better at than anyone I've ever seen is going over the ledge, right? I mean, he can claw his way onto a wave and just leap off, and sometimes he lands and sometimes he wipes out, but he always commits.
Right.
And I do think, which one of us is better at that now? Still him, obviously. But I do think that I am so much better at committing fully without full knowledge. And I think that's largely from watching him and learning from him.
A lot of the book is also about failure, falling off, and finding that was a positive thing because after falling off 10 times, as you put it in the book, you're better off after those falls than you were before those falls. How do you stick with something at the beginning when you're so bad at it and when you're constantly failing?
It's funny because when I wrote the book, I sort of knew I was signing up to be asked questions like that. But it doesn't hit you until you really...
Until I bring it up.
Well, the worst one was I was at a booksellers conference earlier this year, kind of with early copies of the book, and somebody came up to me and very nicely, she said, "I'm so glad I got to meet you." And I said, "Oh, thank you." And she said, because normally when somebody writes a book about something like this, they say, "Oh, well, I'm not a natural surfer," but then you look at them and you say, "Sure." But then I saw you. And I thought, oh, he's not kidding.
Yeah.
And then I had to sit there and sign her book and say, what? I wasn't sure what to say to that. But that question of feeling like you're improving via failure, right? So I had a surf instructor who was, I think he was about 19. I said, "How long have you been surfing?" And he said, "Oh, I've been surfing forever, 7 years since I was in middle school." And, I know some of my former colleagues are here right now. Right? I was 24 when I started working at the White House. I remember walking into a deputy chief of staff's office, and she just turned to her chief of staff and said, "He's very young. This makes me uncomfortable." So I know what it is like to disturb people with your youngness, yes. And suddenly the script was entirely flipped.
Right.
But he was a really good instructor, and what he said to me was, when you start surfing, most of the time, right, 5 times out of every 6, you're going to wipe out. It's going to be incredibly discouraging. But you have to tell yourself, I'm a better surfer than I was before I wiped out. And I started thinking about that in the rest of my life. Right, when I would have a day where I wrote nothing but terrible sentences, and I'd say, okay, I'm a better writer than I was before. In the book, I mentioned putting some of Jackie's workout leggings through the dryer, and they emerged shrinking. And I thought, well, I'm better at laundry before, which I think
appreciated. She did not.
Yeah, she's currently not appreciating it, actually. But I do think, broadly speaking, and I think that was the moment when I realized that this was something I wanted to write about, because I felt like I was embarrassing myself, which was fun, but also that I was learning things that had nothing to do with surfing, that I felt like I could apply in the rest of my life, and that I thought people, whether they surfed or not, could apply in their own lives. And that's when I started to say, oh, this isn't just a hobby. This feels like maybe there's a story here. Maybe there's a book.
So I didn't realize that New Jersey was such a surfing spot until I read this. Is it really not a surfing spot and you just made it one because that's where you went? Or is that like a place on the East Coast that's renowned for surfing?
So New Jersey is an interesting spot for surfing because it is sort of locally renowned. If I ended up going with Matt. We went to Santa Cruz, California, and Hawaii, and we went to France and Spain at one point. And every time I would say, "Oh, what's your favorite place you've surfed so far?" And he would say, "New Jersey." And I think that will always be true. But I think that the thing about New Jersey is surfing is a subculture rather than a culture. If you go to California, it was interesting when I was out there, people would say, oh, my kids learned to surf when they were teenagers. Now they're kind of over it, right? It was a thing that everybody does. So it was interesting being not just getting involved with a culture, but getting involved with a subculture. And it tends to be a particularly kind of Joe Rogan-friendly subculture in New Jersey. I mean, it takes all kinds, but Matt, I think, is much more representative in the water than I am.
Got it. So I do want to talk about your travels. You went to fabulous places, Santa Cruz, Basque Country. Your wife didn't go with you, and you spent the time surfing rather than, I don't know, going to museums or eating in fine dining spots. Did you feel a little weird doing that? Or she felt weird doing that, I'm sure.
I made eye contact with her, which is a mistake. So I think I have the answer to that question. So the worst of these was we were going to go to Ireland where it was and try to do some like intense, manly cold water surfing. And then the waves just weren't working out. So I needed to find another spot. So we ended up going to Basque Country, where Jackie and I had sort of always had an itinerary planned for a romantic vacation one day, which I very quickly repurposed into a surf trip with her brother. So that was a conversation, I would say. But I think that the thing I learned that is really was interesting to me about traveling, because it was particularly when we were in places that neither of us had ever been before. It was interesting that when we were in the water, Matt was still very much in his element, but when we were doing the travel stuff, we were more in my element. And I would say the biggest clash we ended up having, we had plenty, but when I told him I was working on the book, and I said, just so you know, I'm going to write about how we became friends, but I'm also going to write about all the points of contention. He said, you're going to write about the frozen pizza, aren't you?
Yes, you did.
And when we were in Spain, I said, I kept trying to get him to eat pinchos, right, the local Basque delicacy, and he stocked up on frozen pizzas. And at one point he said, are you mad at me for eating frozen pizza? And I said, of course not. And then I left our Airbnb and thought about how righteously angry I actually was. But I do think, it was one of many moments where I feel like I learned a lot, not just about surf culture, not just about the moment we were in, but the broader, how did we end up here in this kind of deeply divided society where we're living? Because all of these small things feel like they mean so much these days.
So I must confess, I went into this book thinking, all right, somehow he learned not to hate, not to loathe someone who is in Red America. At the same time that in this part of your brain, you're saying their policies are cruel, many of these people are xenophobic or homophobic. How did you come to terms with understanding that he may have been part of a larger culture that represents things that you deeply, deeply dislike? And as you say in the book, you're right about them. But at the same time, kind of put that aside and have this very nice relationship with your brother-in-law. How does that work? Many of us are struggling with this. We have family members or friends, or we've broken relationships. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you write, what I found at least, when you write a book like this, you're signing up to be told one type of story. So my first book was about working for President Obama, so I heard every story about the time someone met President Obama. With this book, what I hear a lot about, some surf lesson stuff, obviously, but more than that actually is people who, I hear about people's relationships in their own families, friendships, and it feels like a time when there are so many people who have people in their lives they can't speak to because of politics, and everything feels like politics. And I think one of the things that happens because of that is it becomes very easy to think the worst of people's motivations and the worst of people. So one of the things I always point out is that that's not universally true, right? If Stephen Miller walked in the door and said, "Hey, you want to go surfing?" I would be like, respectfully, no, right? That's not the point. But I do think that in most cases, it's just become too easy for someone to have an opinion you deeply disagree with that can be a matter of right and wrong, not just a matter of opinion, or to make a decision you deeply disagree with. And because of the bubbles that we're all living in, not just liberal bubbles, but all of us are in bubbles, it becomes easy to say the reason you hold that opinion, the reason you're doing that is that you're a bad person. And that, I think, is a really big problem. And it's not just a problem in terms of what it means morally or what it means for our own lives. It's also, we're seeing who that benefits politically, right? Yes. That intense division isn't working out for, I would say, people like us and who believe the things that, that we believe. It's working out very well for people who would rather focus on those divisions so that we don't, we're talking right now as the sort of monstrosity of a budget bill works its way through the Senate, right? People want to take your eye off the ball, and these culture war issues, I think, often are a way to do that.
One of the things that comes across is at the beginning, you clearly did not want to talk anything political with your brother. And then slowly you would kind of tiptoe into conversations. You began to ask him why he likes Joe Rogan, or you would have a conversation about COVID, even if he was spouting some conservative and conspiracy theories. How did you handle that? And do you advise other people to give it a try, or do you suggest that people just talk about the weather and sports?
Well, I think both, right? I think the weather and sports are interesting, or at least sports is interesting. And I think that one of the things I learned from this experience, I sort of imagined, and I do think this was a very like 2008 Obama view of the world, which was that we would spend time together and we would find all this common ground, right? We would start by saying we're really different, and we would end by saying we're not so different, you and I, right? And I think the opposite happened. I started off saying, I think Matt and I don't have a lot in common. And today, I say, I know that Matt and I do not have a lot in common. But that's not as meaningful as we thought, right? We're friends despite that fact. And I think part of what I learned is that common ground is a little overrated because our divisions are real, but neutral ground is underrated. So when you talk about the weather and sports, to me, those are things that you can discuss, that you can spend time together, certainly if you can find ways, activities, right, that sort of common goals that are not the things that divide you. And then what really surprised me was how natural it became over time, over quite a bit of time, for Matt and I. Well, now we just talk about stuff because we're friends and that's what we talk about. So, this week, this has been a weird week because I've just been, literally doing interviews where people are like, what does Matt think about this? What does he think about that? I'm like, I don't know. I have to ask him. Hang on. But even, for example, when we, over the weekend, right, the United States bombed Iran, I was like, I'm curious about what he thinks. Not because I think I'm necessarily going to agree or disagree, but I think, I'm just a curious person, and he's a friend of mine, but also I think I'll learn something, which I did, actually. The biggest thing I learned from that is in the Joe Rogan slice of the MAGA coalition, which is a small but really decisive slice and not the same as kind of like the Charlie Kirk hardcore, MAGA ride or die people. Tulsi Gabbard has a huge amount of credibility because she was a Joe Rogan guest for years and years and years, right? Even when she was a Democrat, she was a Joe Rogan guest. And so for Matt, he was saying, well, Tulsi doesn't think that, it's pretty obvious that her view changed under duress, right? So he says, well, if she doesn't think this is an issue, then it's probably not. And so it was interesting to see that. And it was just one of many moments where I thought, oh, this is a thing about our political landscape, right? The thing I spend a lot of time thinking about when I'm not on a surfboard that I would never know if I didn't have a friend, who comes from a very different perspective.
And you do realize that we're so desperate these days that Tulsi Gabbard is now the voice of sanity in the administration when it comes to intelligence information, which make that, as you will.
Yeah.
It's a little odd, but you take
it's a little odd.
So, one of the things that you did early in the book was you set a goal that you wanted to surf on the North Shore of Oahu. How did you come up with that? And at the time you set the goal, did you think you'd ever make it there? Because that's like hard, really hard.
I thought in a way it was all actually very simple, which was I felt that I was getting a little bit better as a person because I was getting a little better at surfing. So if I got a lot better at surfing, maybe I would get a lot better as a person. Another way of saying that is, and this is true of almost anyone who gets hooked on surfing, I started just looking for excuses. But the excuse or the goal that I found was to try to surf an overhead wave, so, tall, 6 feet basically, on Hawaii's North Shore. And that was sort of two reasons. One, you have to kind of pick a level, but that was clearly consequential, right? I mean, it was big enough that something could go wrong, but not so big that it would definitely kill me, because then it's hard to finish the book. And so that was important, and it felt like, no question, that would require a different version of me, not just physically, but also in my ability to handle fear, in my ability to not panic when a wave is holding you down underwater for a long, long time, in all of those different ways. So I think that was the sort of essence of that goal. Although it's interesting, one of the things that surfing did, I'm still, a type A person or what have you, but I do think there's a part of surfing where the real goal is just to keep surfing. Right? That's what people like about it. And there's now a part of me that understands that, which I never would have imagined.
Got it. So when you started surfing, and it's very comedic, actually, and you make yourself the butt of the joke. There's a whole process of learning to stand up on the board, of getting yourself into a wetsuit, which can be difficult. As you were doing these things, did you have in the back of your mind, I'll think this is funny one day, but it's not right now?
No, I did not. Getting into a this is the thing about surfing that I did not fully appreciate, is that doing it is obviously hard, but just getting to the point where you can begin doing it is the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. And it's also among the most embarrassing. So a wetsuit is basically just a shame garment, right? It's just it's like getting it on is deeply humiliating, and then once you're wearing it, if you happen to catch a glimpse of yourself, it is also deeply humiliating.
Yes.
So there's really no upside. And the one thing, I mean, for me, a important sort of moment in my surfing life, and I think probably in my non-surfing life, was when I sort of finally felt comfortable just sort of like walking around in a wetsuit on the way to the beach. And I thought, oh, this must mean I look really good in a wetsuit. And then eventually I was like, nope, that's not what that means. Right. It just means that I'm comfortable with it, which
is a lesson.
Which in and of itself is a good thing.
Now, one of the fascinating parts of the book were the teachers that you came upon. And I think going into it, and I would have probably had the same, you were expecting someone to say, no, turn your head a little bit to the left, lean forward. And there were all kinds of different styles, but none of them were that. What did you learn about how to teach somebody and kind of the frustrations of not being taught in a way you have before, which is very specific, very analytical, very particular?
One of the things I learned in general about surfing is that most people in the surf industry, and I think they would tell you this, are more interested in surf than industry. Right? Very few people became a surf instructor because they love pedagogy. They became a surf instructor because they like surfing. And I totally respect that. So I do think it's a little bit haphazard. The thing that really surprised me about learning and learning from people was how little of it, as you're saying, was about sort of bits of physical technique and how much of it was about rethinking, right? Often from people who didn't sort of identify as, for me, right, overthinking is a way of life. For, I would say, good surfers, you have to be the opposite. But I remember, for example, I had one early surf lesson with another teenager, and the first teenager I mentioned was actually a surprisingly good instructor, and the second teenager has a ways to go, to put it mildly. And so basically every time, if I fell off, he would say, oh, you fell off. And I would say, well, okay, should I do something differently? And he'd be like, well, you probably just want to be balanced. And say, okay, thank you. This is so helpful. If I didn't fall off, if I caught the wave, he'd be like, oh, you caught the wave. And I'd say, that's great. Do you know what I should do again? He's like, yeah, you should do that. It's like, okay. And so I was in deep frustration, and it was hot out, and I'm starting to sunburn and sweat, and sunscreen is running into my eyes. And right before, and then he says, and we're about to end the lesson, he says, you know what your problem is? And first of all, no good conversation starts, you know what your problem is. But he says, you know what your problem is? You spend all your time thinking about whether you're going to make it or not. You're thinking, am I going to make this wave or am I not going to make this wave? And it's like, I would rather you commit more and miss more waves than spend all your time thinking about what's going to happen. And it is so eye-opening to have your personality diagnosed by a teenager.
Yes. And one who is not terribly verbally communicative.
Especially a teenager where, to put it very mildly, this comes out of left field. But that happened to me a lot, where somehow I felt like people teaching me to surf were able to pinpoint things about me, and many of them were things that I, in retrospect, I'm glad that, they're still part of me, but I feel like that I was able to change, in part because of surfing and in part because of the knowledge that I acquired.
And now the question I'm sure you must be asked more than any else, and that is, did Matt like the book?
The short answer is yes, thankfully. The longer answer is, so Matt had originally said he didn't want to read the book until it came out, which, and so I finished the book, and the last line of the acknowledgement says, Matt, you said you didn't want to read the book till it came out. Then a couple months ago, he said, actually, I would like to read the book, but it was too late to change it. So that was the worst possible thing, where it was like, on one hand, if he hated it, it was going to be a long few months.
Yes.
But on the other hand, there was no chance to change it. But he was doing a job in Asbury Park, so I drove over, and it was I felt a little like a horror movie, where I walked into this empty house just holding a book, and the first line of the book is, Matthew Kapler is my brother-in-law, and we're very different, and one of the biggest differences between us is that if I lived like him, I would die. And he looked at that and he just started laughing. And I was like, okay, we're going to be good.
Right.
The one thing he's pointed out as he read it for the first time is he was like, yeah, that's about the minivan that we rented. Didn't you ding up that minivan? And I made it clear to him that according to the book, the answer to that question is no.
Yes. This was a rental vehicle?
This was a rental vehicle.
Okay. All right.
The other thing I just did want to say quickly, because it was fun, is that, so this is only the second book talk that I've done now. The first one was 2 days ago in Spring Lake, New Jersey. And so Matt actually got to join that one, which was so we sort of did a 3-person Q&A. And that was a really nice experience, because I felt like, it was also like, to me, this feels like, yes, I'm the author of it, but it's our story. So it's nice that he feels the same way.
Got it. We want to leave plenty of time for you folks to ask questions. So there's a mic right here. If you can line up, we will go in order. And we ask that your question be in the form of a question, and that it be relatively succinct so we can get as many people as possible. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm here. My daughter invited me. She's a friend of yours and your wife's. I grew up in La Jolla, Pacific Beach. And when I grew up, there weren't surfboards. There was a longboard. There was one classmate that would surf on that longboard. One day I got a call from the hospital, and I'll get to this point. Said, your younger brother is in the hospital. He'd been injured in a surfing accident. Well, there were 13 years between my younger brother and I. And when I got to the emergency room, finally I could talk to him, and I said, what were you doing out surfing? You're supposed to be in college, in class. He said, well, I was. We have a surf class in college. And I had no idea. Out of the 5 boys, he was the blue collar, similar to your brother. Great boy, great brother. My question is, it was very hard for the other 4 of us to overcome the difference between Mike and us, which were college and politically engrossed and involved. How did you overcome that? I think that's quite amazing. I'd like to know that.
Well, I think it's interesting, the word that you used, which is overcome. And I think that's probably not possible, right? And I also don't think it's necessarily the right goal. Because to me, what I think is important, and this is the other thing that I think is I do want to be very clear about, as I've talked about this book over the last week or so since it's been out. I mean, one friendship is a very small sample size. It is the literal smallest sample size. So I don't know your brother, But I do think that the idea of overcoming, to me, is part of the again, it just needs to be rethought a little bit, where it's more about living in the same. It's just living together, right? And I think about this not just in the sense of individual families, but in the sort of metaphor of a national, right, the American family. That so much of democracy is this question of how do you live with people who you think are wrong, and that you don't really do it by, I don't think, overcoming those differences. You learn it. You do it by finding something else to focus on. At least in my experience.
And when you and Matt began to talk politics, it wasn't as if there was an aha moment, but occasionally he would say, oh, that's a good point. And occasionally you would say, oh, that was kind of interesting. On the show, Rubin.
I do want to make it clear that it was not just sort of me instructing the way that when it came to surfing, it was a very one-way experience. But when it came to, I feel like I learned a lot, not so much things that completely changed my worldview, but I learned a lot of things, certainly as somebody who thinks about political communication of, boy, it feels like we're maybe obviously talking the wrong way about a lot of stuff.
And what is the right way? Based upon your sample size of one.
Well, let me give you two things that I thought about with that. So just two examples. So one is I did not realize that conspiracy theories are fun. Right? That I don't think of someone who, I'm not into conspiracy theories, but if you talk to Rogan fans, they will be like, oh, he's into conspiracy theories. And it's a fun game as well as something that ends up being serious. But I think sometimes when someone is having fun and you say, your fun thing is a bad thing, how come you don't like me? I could figure that one out, right? So I think that's part of one of the things that I learned. And then, there's a bunch of others. I want to leave time for audience questions, but I'll see if I can shoehorn a couple of them in.
Absolutely. Please come on up, get in line. We don't bite, so come on up if you would like. Even if you don't have a question, you can come up and say hi. Matt's now feeling terrible. David is now feeling terrible. Oh, here we go. Another brave soul. Thank you.
Did you like growing up? You didn't grow up with, but the Beach Boys.
I did like the Beach Boys. I didn't. I kind of thought that I understood surfing because of the Beach Boys, and it turns out only one of the four of them surfed, which I now kind of get.
But they had cool shirts.
They did have cool shirts.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead.
Hi, David. I read your first book, Thanks, Obama, and I'm excited to read your current book. My question to you is, are you still surfing? And if so, how's it going?
It's going differently depending on the day. But I am still surfing. So earlier today, I was, Matt actually texted and was like, are you, waves are pretty good. You want to go out later? I was like, well, I'm sort of doing what I think is actually literally the opposite of surfing, which is giving a book talk at Politics and Prose. But I think tomorrow, hopefully, it'll be good. And so I'm hoping to get out. What's been different and kind of interesting. I was worried that once the sort of surfing I did for the book was over, I would lose either the sort of sense of like motivation to do it, or that Matt and I would lose the thing that was sort of forcing us to hang out. And actually, it was almost the opposite of both. That without the pressure of also having to write about stuff, it was like, oh, we can just have fun with this, which has been great.
Do you have a new goal, or are you just surfing?
I don't really have a new goal, which I think is like totally not like me in a way that I am happy about. I think that, Matt and I have talked about trying to get back to the North Shore this fall. So I guess my goal now would be to get back into shape enough that will be okay. But I would like to, and then there's a bunch of very specific surfing goals that will bore, I would guess, 90% of you. So I'm going to leave those out.
Very good, very good. And by the way, you do a very good job of explaining something that none of us, I don't want to say none of us, most of us will never do. And you managed to make it sound even scarier than it probably is, as the giant wave encompasses you. Now, there were a number of instances where you went under, and you described the sense of not being able to breathe. Did you at any point feel like, I'm going to die?
I don't think that I felt like the closest I came to feeling that sense of panic was when I was out by myself in the winter.
Yes.
And lost my board, right? Because the board sort of took off without me. And then I had this, I would say, I describe in the book as knowing what it feels like to be out of options.
Yes.
And that turns out to be a bad feeling and a thing you don't get to unknow. I think the thing that was really fascinating, but only in retrospect, is the feeling of being held under by a wave. It is like the only reason any of us are here is for billions of years we evolved to not do that, right? Like any of our ancestors who didn't have that thought of I should avoid this didn't reproduce.
Yes.
And so it is a very visceral evolutionary thing to say I don't want to be here in this moment. And that there was probably the biggest wave that I ever wiped out on, which was kind of double overhead. So basically it's like being chucked out of a second story window, which I don't recommend. And I remember after that it took a month, 2 months, not a month, took about a month for me to feel comfortable in the water again, just because of it. It wasn't like a thought. It was a deep, deep feeling.
Right. Come on up. Don't be afraid. Yes.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi. I just have 2 questions. The first was that I think you mentioned at the very beginning that you were going through a period of depression. So I was wondering, when you sort of endeavored to learn surfing, was it more of for like personal development, or was it more to heal or like, I guess, grow a bond with your brother-in-law? And then my other question was just, you mentioned obviously you're an overthinker and your brother-in-law maybe is not. So I was wondering, I imagine you were really interested in digging into your political differences. Was he interested in interrogating them? Was he more interested in just like, let's stay on the neutral ground?
So your first question about, I would say what really happened is that Jackie, who obviously we both know, every so often during the pandemic and sort of the post-pandemic, I would be reading the news and worrying, and she would say, you really should pick up a hobby. And I would say, I already have a hobby, and my hobby is reading the news and worrying. And so eventually, as you know well, she's a persistent person. And so eventually she got me to take her advice, which was a good idea. I think that was a big part of it. And I also think early on, I originally didn't want to tell Matt that I'd started surfing because I thought he was going to be sort of judgy about it because he's so much better than I am. And also he's a naturally talented surfer, and I sadly am not. And I think, and it sort of segues into this, the second thing you were going to say, originally I didn't want to talk, I think I was more scared to talk about our differences that I would say are political, but these days, what isn't, right? Even like, what music do you listen to? That's a political question in a way I wish it wasn't. And so I think I was really nervous about it. And a lot of the book, like I've been talking about, is about fear, but I also think we're living in a moment when it's so easy to feel afraid of each other. Right? I didn't even know what would happen if we had a conversation like that, but I definitely felt afraid to. And so part of it was, when we started to have those conversations, it was, I think, because we both felt on some level less afraid.
Hi. Okay. I have a question. I just wanted to say, like, how amazing to have a book about overcoming fear and how much easier it should be for people to talk to each other.
Thank you.
Washington Post could learn that too. And I wanted to ask, did you get hurt a lot or at all physically?
Did I hit? Yes, I got hurt, I would say, constantly. I didn't get injured, thankfully. I feel like, I learned lots of life lessons, and one of my life lessons that I learned was surfboards hurt when they hit you in the face. And I think that's not applicable to most people's lives most of the time, but in the moment when it becomes applicable, you will really want to apply it. The thing I learned about surfing that I took away from surfing and I think about often is just the feeling of like, this is going to suck until it doesn't, right? Sometimes that's the only way to deal with something. And with surfing in particular, low-level pain is kind of constant. You're bruising yourself. You're sort of in a constant war with your own surfboard. The surfboard is winning. When it's not, a wave is usually trying to beat you up in some way. And even good surfers, that's the crazy thing. There's like any good hobbyist now, I follow a lot of people online. And sometimes I'll read an interview with a surfer who's like, oh, yeah, I remember that wipeout. It was awesome. I broke my back. And you're like, wait a second. I understand the first part of that and the second part of that, but how did you link those? And I think it's just, I don't do that, but I think I come much closer than I ever imagined I might.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have not read the book, but
Get
I
out.
will. So I'm a little curious, when you were starting to think about the book, did you read, it seems that you're sort of in between genres of the, discourse, middle ground, memoir. What inspired you? Were they like rock climbers? What kind of books were you reading?
That's a great question. So first of all, I would say this book started off very, very different than it ended, where for me, this was a book where I felt, okay, I want this book to be sort of a semi-retirement from being a semi-professional political person. So 1/4 something. I'm not getting my math right. But I did feel like this was not a political book at all. And then as I started surfing with Matt, I started to feel like actually I am learning more about politics from my decision to do something that had nothing to do with politics than I would have if I had stayed focused fully on politics. And also, the run-up to the election was occurring, and suddenly the divides between me and Matt were the same divides that were completely reshaping our country, and that we're living through a country, I think, that's shaped by those divides right now. And so it kind of, it was like just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in kind of situation, where what started as a book that was purely about falling off surfboards became something else. And along those lines, one of my favorite books is A River Runs Through It. I don't know if you've read that. That's one of the only books where I'm like, okay, I know my job is to sell my book, but also if you could read that, you should read that book first. That's a great book. But then read my book. And that's a book about someone and his brother fly fishing. But it's really, the question of that book is, what does it mean to love someone you don't understand? And I think this is a little bit of a different question, which is what does it mean to learn from someone you don't understand? But I still have described this book sometimes as I was trying to write A River Runs Through It, but for surfing, and no one dies in the end.
Okay, thank you.
They mentioned it. I thought about that as I was saying it, that they mentioned it early, that there's things end poorly in that one.
So when I go in the ocean, my wife says, go in front of the lifeguard. So my question to you is, was your wife nervous about this dangerous hobby? And also, was she very happy that you were establishing this relationship with her brother?
Were you nervous about my dangerous hobby?
Remember why?
Yes. So early, the first time Matt and I went surfing, I was sort of doing my own mental preparation, which mostly involved Googling how to die while surfing. Not, how not to die, I guess. And Jackie said to me, don't worry, I told my brother that if he kills you, it's going to make family parties very awkward. And I said, okay, what did he say? And she said, well, he laughed. And I said, all right, did he say, don't worry, I won't kill him? And she did not say anything to that. So I think the answer was somewhat. And I think there's also, and again, I'm just trying to read your response to see if I'm right about this. I think that the way that Jackie felt about her brother and I being friends was less enthusiastic or unenthusiastic than completely and totally flabbergasted. And I think that's probably still true, even though, it's now been 3 years since we started surfing together.
So is Matt your only friend who is not an overthinking, progressive urbanite?
I don't know. I mean, I have a lot of friends here. Do any of you fit that description? I don't know. I think it is. I will say, again, thinking about. I don't know about that specifically, but I do think when I felt that we were drafted onto different teams, I do feel like most of my friends, the vast majority of them, are on my team, right? Not because I say I only want to hang out with people like me, but because it just ends up happening. And that's also true, by the way, for, because I feel like one of the things that defines a liberal bubble is constant worry and sort of self-recrimination about being in a liberal bubble.
Yes.
Otherwise we wouldn't be good liberals. But I think that it's also true of people who would not identify as liberals even in the slightest. And one of the things that I noticed was that during the pandemic, when the issue of vaccination really divided Matt and me even more than before, it wasn't he spent more time in his bubble as well. When we started surfing together again, I could see that he had sort of hardened some of his positions, even if he didn't think of them as political, and I had probably hardened some of mine also. And that, I think, was also eye-opening. Right? That was not a good thing.
We all got crazier. And when you realize that you're thinking a lot about how he thinks about things, how it's going to go, was it mutual, or is this sort of like the California, the Los Angeles, San Francisco rivalry, where only one city thinks that they're in a rivalry and the other just doesn't think about the other at all?
Well, so do you mean were we in a rivalry? I'm not sure I fully understand.
You spent a lot of time thinking about how he was going to interpret things, what he would think. Did he spend time thinking about you in the same way, or he just kind of was?
I don't know, because we're men. Right, so we don't talk about that.
Okay.
I feel like, so I've sort of had to intuit it, but one of the things I've learned in the process of spending time, and not just Matt, but also a couple of the other people in the book, was realizing that assuming what someone is thinking is just a really bad idea. And often what they're thinking is so much more interesting. You may not agree with it, but it's more interesting than what you think they're thinking. So I think I would say that I'm going to add that to my enormous list of questions to ask Matt, although that one I might have to work up to.
Right, exactly. Come on up, anyone who wants to ask a question. I'll vamp in the meantime.
Yeah, please do.
So what political advice would you now give a candidate, for example, running in a district that has a lot of people like Matt? What are some practical takeaways for political people?
I can think of a couple, but two that jump to mind. Actually, let me do one that jumps to mind because I see that Devin is ready with a question. The one that jumps to mind is, and I think we just saw it in the mayoral primary in New York, you have to be on people's phones. And I kind of hate that as a former speechwriter, right? Is that it's not a phone-friendly medium as much, but I think it's true. And one of the huge divides, as you know, in the 2024 election was: do you get your news from sort of traditional sources, or do you get your news from your phone? And the more news, the greater percentage of news you got on your phone, the more likely you were to vote for Trump. And I don't think we're going to convince people to stop getting news on their phone. So I think you have to figure out how can you be on people's phones, because that's where the people are. Not everybody, but a really decisive group of people. So that's, for example, we're thinking about right now. Somebody asked me yesterday if I were a Democrat messaging against talking about the budget bill that's going through. What would I say based on this? And what I say is less about the message and more about how do you create content that can live on a phone and distribute that message. And I know a lot of you do that for a living, so I feel a little silly being the one sitting up here and saying it. But I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
Okay. Nothing deep from my questions, but long or short board, when are you pitching Netflix on Endless Political Summer? And would Jackie be supportive if you decided your next goal would be to surf Nazaré?
Let me answer the easiest one first. No. I don't think that Jackie would be excited about me surfing a 100-foot wave, because that's called murder, and it's frowned upon. I think Endless Political Summer, I feel like we're already living through, so I don't think we need to pitch Netflix on that one. What remind me of long or short board? So for surfers, long boards are often kind of considered. They're definitely easier to ride, so they're sometimes looked down on a little bit. They're more elegant, but less macho and athletic. So I started on a longboard. I'm working my way down. And so hopefully this summer and then for hurricane season, my goal is to be on a shortboard, or at least what I would consider shortboard, like a 6-foot
I love
board.
how he says that for hurricane season. So
Yeah.
you're going to surf during hurricane service. That's a big part of the year.
Yeah, I mean, hurricane season is kind of, you were asking about Jersey waves, and hurricane season in New Jersey is as good as anywhere, as long as you get good hurricanes. And so you become the weirdo who's like, I hope we get lots of good hurricanes this year.
Yeah.
And I always thought in New Jersey, particularly because of Hurricane Sandy, people would temper that by saying, and no, people are just like, yeah, let's just hope we get some good hurricanes. Okay.
Here we go.
If you don't mind, I'll ask you, considering the fact you've had that background of surfing, and considering the fact where we are today politically in this country, could you relate more to where the media is? It's difficult for them to stay on the board at this particular time. They're not sure because they're falling off one side to the other. Could you speak to that maybe?
Well, I feel like this means that we have succeeded in this talk, and perhaps even that I've succeeded in the book, because I feel like I am just hopelessly addicted to surf metaphors now. And so the fact that you are also speaking in surf metaphors, I think is, I'm going to take as a compliment.
Right.
Thank you.
So let me ask kind of a big philosophy question. Do you think you're a better person now? You said you wanted to get to be a better surfer and you'd hope to be a better person. Do you think that happened?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know. No, I'm definitely a better surfer, and I would say I'm definitely a better person too. Not in every respect, but I think that I'm absolutely more courageous than I was. I'm much more able to handle the kind of deep uncertainty that we're all living through, and I think I am more. I guess I would say the easy way to say it is that I'm less judgmental, but more than that, I think I'm more open to a wider range of experiences and learning from a wider array of people. And, to me, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write all of this down, because I feel like, when you write a nonfiction book, I always think you want to feel like you know a secret or multiple secrets. Yes. And I feel like those are some of the secrets that I know and wanted to share.
So do you have another book in mind now, or are you just, pardon the metaphor, deep under the wave or deep under water in this one?
Well, no. So this was the first of a 2-memoir deal, which is great, except now I thought, by that point, of course, I'll know exactly what I'll do that's memoir worthy. Now I have no idea. Right. So I have to figure it out.
You have to have some more experience.
Yeah, I actually think it's good that professionally I am obligated to do something interesting. There are worse things in the world, and I think we're so aware of all of them most of the time.
Yes, exactly. All right. Any other questions for us? All right. Well, why don't we end on this then? Not everybody wants to surf. Me in particular. What are the qualities that you think people should look for when they're looking for a hobby? What do you want to develop in yourself? Is it just purely, is it fun? Is it something that you're afraid of? How would you advise people to go about, everyone says, I need to get away from all this. I need a hobby. I need to do something. How would you go about selecting it?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm disappointed to find out that my secret plan for this afternoon, which was to convince Jen Rubin to start surfing, has failed. Yeah, it's all right. C'est la vie. I think I would say 2 things about hobbies. Well, first of all, the idea that I am in any way a evangelist of hobbies, like life is weird. But I would say, number 1, do something where you can't bring your phone. I think that's so, a lot of this I would like to say is sort of personal growth and things that changed me and all of that. And that is true. But also the fact that I am doing something regularly where if I brought my phone with me, my phone would explode, I think is really important if you are living in the times we're living in and feeling a deep sense of stress about it. The second thing that I would say, I think you touched on, which is figuring out the right kind of fear. I mean, not all hobbies have to be scary, but I do think that there is something really that I learned is just so valuable, especially as a grown-up, when you can choose not to be afraid more often, or at least you can choose in the sort of short term, right? The thing you do hour by hour to be less afraid. To choose to try to embrace the right kind of fear, the fear that says you're in the right spot, and to think about that in a way where it's helping you deal with the kinds of fears that I think we all get more of as an adult, but we have a lot less control over. And so I think that's going to be different for everyone. I'm still holding out hope one day, Jen, right. But it doesn't have to be surfing. I think that if you do something that scares you the right amount, you'll benefit from it.
As you've been talking, I'm thinking there's been a lot of talk about making our children more resilient. Maybe we have to start making ourselves more resilient.
Yeah,
as well.
I think that's very true.
So why don't you give Matt, I keep calling you Matt because now I'm always thinking of Matt. David, a round of applause, who's been great. The book is terrific. I highly, highly recommend it. So.
Thank you.